Hello, and welcome back to another CBH Talk. I'm here today with CBHA President Joe Martin, and we are going to be having a conversation with Robert Stevens, author of the book To Make a Killing, which highlights Arthur Cutton's rise from humble beginnings to becoming a legend on Wall Street. And we'll get right into it. So, Robert, could you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and what compelled you to write this book?
Sure. Pleasure to be here with you folks this morning. I'm looking forward to our talk. My background is journalism. I was a business investigative journalist for over a decade with the Globe and Mail the Globe and Mail Report on Business, the Toronto Star. I worked in Ottawa for the Journal at the time. So my interests are, and before that, I was a stockbroker in Toronto. I worked for a small institutional house and did a lot of the analysis and research for the clients of the firm. So a lot of business background, a lot of business writing, understanding the markets, understanding what can take place in the markets. I think kind of just opened me up to the idea when I came across it of this crazy fellow called Arthur Cutton, who very few people had heard of, and he was the more you dig into it, you find that he was one of the richest SOBs at the time. He made his way through the markets like a swashbuckler. He was a curious blend of secrecy and showmanship. And so I think I just got hooked because I was naturally a detective, and naturally interested in business. And also, I guess the greatest thing is he was Canadian. He grew up in Guelph, Ontario. He came from a middle-class background. And so I became interested generally in that story. It took me 10 years of research because I wasn't working on it full time. The Globe and Mail wouldn't have liked that too much, I don't think. And so after 10 years, I got very close to having it done. I had left the Globe and thought, okay, full time, let's do this. So that's really the story of my involvement with Arthur Cutton.
Okay, let me, Robert. Like you, my first job was as an investment analyst, only on the buy side with the old Monarch Life from Winnipeg. And while I departed from it after only 2 years, there was an interesting area. And later in my career with a co-author, I wrote a book on financial systems of the two countries. So my co-author being an American, he did the section on the Pecora hearings.
Right.
I did the section on the Macmillan Royal Commission on Canada, which was the counterpart. I know a lot of people on Bay Street. I guess you're understating it, if anything, when you say he's unknown. He's really, I'm talking about Cutton. He's really unknown. I mean, yeah. I talk to golfers and they know him because there's a Cutton club in Guelph.
Exactly.
But how did you even discover anything about him? I'd never heard anything about him until I read your book. And I've asked a lot of Bay Street types and none of them had ever heard of him.
No, absolutely. You've probably heard of Jesse Livermore and his career. He was the famous short seller that made hundreds of millions of dollars during the crash. An infamous trader and speculator. And his nemesis, his challenger, biggest challenger in the market happened to be Cutton. And so I only understood the impact and the seriousness of Cutton in the market through an understanding of his impact on Jesse Livermore, which was a great revelation. The when we get into talking about how did this book evolve, it took 10 years because Cutton he covered his tracks really well. He didn't want anything known about him. He wanted to stay completely off the radar. He didn't want government agencies or government bureaucrats to know anything about him. And because of that, everything was so secretive that it became to me, a great challenge, and it actually made it fun, but it made it very difficult finding any source material.
What was that process like of finding the source material because it was so challenging? Like, how did you even go about it?
Well, he at one point he built an estate outside of Chicago near a place called Downers Grove, peculiar name. And this was a 800-acre estate where he grew his cattle and his sheep and his whatever else he was growing. And he, of course, didn't want a lot of people knowing about that either. But he did, because of the local nature of the estate, there had to be local people that got to know him. These would be people who came to shoe his horses. These would be people that came and picked up the farm produce. These would be people that managed his farm. He had domestic staff, and these are the individuals that I spent a long time trying to find. I was successful in finding a couple of them whose grandfathers or great grandfathers worked for Cutton. I interviewed one guy who was in his 90s at the time, and he was a source of great information, telling me what it was like to be around Cutton, what kind of individual Cutton was. And this is where you really find out who the individual is, right? I mean, you can get a ton of stats and facts and information and numbers, which paint a kind of a shell picture, but you don't really get to know the individual. And I was lucky in finding a few people that really knew him well and introduced me to his world.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Guelph and then about his voyage from Guelph to Chicago in 1890.
Right.
Being a not untypical Torontonian, I guess my knowledge of Guelph goes back to the fact that both of my daughters attended the University of Guelph, so I obviously was at least 2 convocations and often out there to see my beloved daughters. But what I've been surprised at is how Guelph plays, because J.J., as I turn to business history in the early part of the century, of course, J.J. Hill is a pretty central figure. There was a business historian at the Harvard Business School I knew, and he said he was thinking of doing a book on immigrants from countries around the world who've been successful in the United States. And he asked my opinion about J.J. Hill. And I said, I think that would be terrific. I mean, I visited the Hill Mansion in St. Paul, Minnesota. And, I love the story of J.J. Hill meeting with Donald Smith, later Lord Strathcona, in the middle of winter on the open prairie, both in a dog sled, one going north, one going south.
Yeah.
So Professor Tedlow was thinking of including J.J. Hill as a Canadian. And we talked a few times, and I said, by the way, there's just been a survey in Guelph of the most famous people in Guelph, and Hill came 3rd. Well, Tedlow was shocked. He said, who the hell could be more important than J.J. Hill? I said, well, there was a poet. A poet? I said, yes. His name was Arthur McRae, and he wrote a very, very famous poem. Yeah. And then after Arthur McRae, there was Johnson from the Metropolitan Opera Company.
Yeah.
And the building, of course, the U of T is named after him.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't impress Tedlow at all. I think he dropped the project. But here, and then all of a sudden, I read your book, Here's a fourth person.
Yeah.
Do the people in Guelph know about him?
Know about him at the time?
Well, even today, does anyone know about who Cutton was?
Very, very few people today. At the time, he was, his dad was fairly well recognized. He was a middle-class lawyer. The Cutton name was associated with everything British and very proper. They attended the right church. They attended the right social circles. So I think at the time that Cutton was well known. Cutton, his father, Walter, was an elected alderman. He was chair of the financial council of the city. He also started his own business, a private banking concern, which we should talk a little bit about because that's a very key thing that drove Cutton to Arthur Cutton to leave the city. But I think the name Cutton is today largely forgotten. Of course, you mentioned that it's known. The name Cutton is more associated with the golf club, which really has nothing to do other than the fact that Cutton started it. And there's interesting stories about his wealth being buried out there and no one ever finding it. People coming up from the U.S. trying to tear up the golf course, tear up the members' lounge, look under the floorboards for Cutton's millions, and no one ever finding it. So there's that aspect to it. But the name Cutton out, I was going to mention also the J.J. Hill had a brother called Alex, and Alex was a blacksmith that lived outside of Guelph, small distance away, and Arthur Cutton would often go out and visit Alex Hill, and the reason he liked to do that is that he was mentally comparing what was the difference between someone that stayed in Guelph and a brother who had a brother went to the U.S. What were the dynamics that drove people to do certain things or not? And so he was fascinated with Alex, because Alex was just a happy-go-lucky guy who didn't make a lot of his life, but was unlike his brother. And so I find it fascinating that already at that tender age of, 18 or 19, that Cutton was thinking deeply about having a completely different life.
In 1890,
Yeah.
with this drive, which was very different from his sibling, he made the decision to go elsewhere to seek his fortune, and he went to Chicago, a very important city.
Yeah.
But it was further from Guelph than New York, and only half the size. Do you have any idea why he chose Chicago over New York?
It may have been only half the size of New York, but it was 10 times the size of Guelph. So it was, it was still an immense step for a young lad who came from a relatively small village. Don't forget they had just gone, 2 years later through Confederation, and it was, I think the village was 25,000 at the time. Not a lot of people, mostly still rural, still farming based. So it was still a big shock for the young Cutton to end up in a place where lived and died by your wits. There was you lived by what you could do and your skills. There was no giveaways, no shortcuts. And he lived in, of course, when he arrived there, were like all new immigrants to the city, lived in the south side, which was the meatpacking area, which was 40% first generation, mostly Italian and Polish. And he had to he lived a pretty precarious life, hand to mouth for several years before he was able to feel that he wasn't going to die a starving individual. Can I mention, I don't know if we were going to get into it, but I think it is important to say that and maybe Tabitha, you were going to ask the question, but the whole Guelph banking company that his dad owned, were you interested in looking at that? Because for me, that was something that I discovered. I didn't know about it. It's a relatively new aspect that comes out in the book. What really drove Cutton to cross the border.
Yeah, tell us more about that, because one of the things that I find so interesting is the way that the economic system and its evolution is woven into the book. So maybe tell us a bit about his father's private banking situation.
It's interesting because his dad was, of course, I mentioned that he was an alderman and on the financial council, and they had a beautiful house built for them. It's still there today on it's called Sunset. It's still there. You can go and visit it if you'd like. His dad's old house, where the family grew up. Young Arthur and his siblings attended the Guelph Collegiate Institute, which was just down the road a bit. His dad was starting to make this name for himself. In fact, one of the local farmers said he decided to place his money with Walter Cutton's bank because he had a fine horse and a nice building. These are how people judged each other at the time. Anyway, his dad started this private banking business in 1888, and it was, obviously conflicted, because as a lawyer, you can take money on deposit. You can take money in, and you're supposed to be paying your clients, your clients' creditors or whatever, and you're also their banker. It sets up I think a pretty serious conflict. It didn't seem to bother the dad very much, and consequently, he ended up taking money out of accounts that he had no right taking money from. He got caught appropriating funds and fraud. He got nailed in 4 counts that went before the courts. Interestingly, the village of Guelph now turning against him, which is a very serious thing in those days. Memory is generational in those days there, and he lost everything. He had to sell his house. He had to sell his business banking establishment. He had to resign resign from the political circles. His son had to take care of him financially for pretty much the rest of his life. And this deep shame, the Cutton family name absorbed because of his dad's foolishness, is something that I think just put him out. He was thinking about going to work in the U.S. anyway. This just put him over the top. He was so embarrassed and ashamed that his father would put him in such a situation and ruin the reputation of the family that he had to get away.
Wow.
Do you think that contributed to the way that he started to ruthlessly amass wealth then going forward, because he had this experience with his father?
Absolutely. It made him say, I think, drove him to think like the logic would be, my dad was really stupid. He got caught.
Mhm.
I'm gonna do something. I'm gonna show them how to do it properly and not get caught. I'm gonna build an empire that from scratch, that people someday will look back at and go, my God, how did he do it? I think that was a huge motivation for him.
Mhm. That's interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah. He and the other aspect to that is because he felt so shamed, he spent much of his wealth giving money back to his hometown.
Mhm.
He built a YMCA in Guelph. He contributed money to the church, huge amounts. He built the golf course, and donated it. Wanted to donate it. There was wrinkles in that. He could not because of the depression, and no one wanted it because it was too costly. But so he was always looking for ways to atone for his dad's his dad's sins.
There seems to be almost sort of like a two-pronged thing with it too. Like there's that bit about atoning for the sins of his father, but there's also that part about becoming more powerful through money, right? Which was something that he saw his father lose, right? He lost his reputation, he lost his power. So I thought it was interesting. One of the themes in your book is about the intersection between business and law and politics. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on how Cutton's dealings with the U.S. legal system during his life sort of revealed the power dynamics between those wealthy businessmen and the government regulation.
Right on. He and this goes back to why he maintained such secrecy. He knew that the bureaucrats, the government, later on the FDR administration, were going to take a run at him. I mean, I think because of his dad's experience, pretty much expected that things might go terribly wrong if he was too well known. Of course, that is a dichotomy for him because he was, at the time, the name Cutton, although people didn't know him, I mean, they didn't know about him, they didn't know very much about him, they knew the name. Mm-hmm. And if you read in the Wall Street Journal of the time that Cutton was buying a certain stock, you had to run out and buy it because it was gonna appreciate triple, quadruple, whatever, in a matter of days. So the name Cutton became synonymous with instant wealth. You could not ignore his impact on the market because he was just too powerful.
Well, I'm going to talk about the influence on Cutton to me to this day. Somewhere in there, you've got an incredible quote about saying he was advising a friend who had a number of investments, and he said, "No, you just want a very few." Yep. And of course, as the average investment advisor is taught, and when you're advising your clients, diversify so that they're safe. Yeah. Safety and diversity. Well, he did, and I want you to know that, as you can tell, I'm getting on in years, and I've looked at my portfolio. I'm far overweight in equities versus debt. So when I've gone through my list of 10 stocks, decided which 5 I'm going to keep, and I'm selling 5 and putting it into debt.
Right.
And I've got the quote from Cutton right at the top of the page where I'm doing the analysis.
He love you.
I guess the other thing, here's this kid from Guelph. He's got this desire and everything else, but he's in Chicago, which, as you say, it still was 1 million people plus in 1890. How does he get a start?
Yeah, he does all these menial jobs when he arrives. He's living, zero cash inflow and everything outflow, and he's living with a couple of friends from. There's some interesting fact I just wanted to mention. a couple of friends in boarding houses in the southern district of Chicago. One of his friends was the brothers who ended up running a Moore meat packing group, and they became very powerful, and he got to know them, and I think did very well with them, and together they did things in the market that we should get into. But how did he, how did he run his market? How did he run his trading accounts, and who was he trading with? I'm just trying to find one mention of when he was living in early days in Chicago. Another friend, a Canadian actually, was by the name of Thomas Wilson, and this is the fellow who started Wilson Sporting Goods. And they became very close, and so there's kind of that interesting aspect there. He got his start in a company. Arthur got his start in a company called A.S. White, which was a British commodity trader that was working on the Chicago Board of Trade, whose job it was to basically help their British clients buy and sell on the board. And Arthur's job at the time was a very menial, tracking the accounts and doing the accounting for the firm. People looked at Arthur, even when he was older, and he would go to summoned to a hearing or required to attend a congressional hearing. He'd walk in and people were just aghast at this little man who looked more like a hardware merchant. It's been described as a hardware merchant, or a pastor at the local church, not a wealthy, J.P. Morgan type individual. So he even didn't want to look the part, let alone play the part. Sorry, you were asking how he got started.
Well, that's right. But tell us a little bit more. Then, where did he get his first big break?
Right. So he was. The Board of Trade had some really rugged individuals at the time. These are people who would, there were no rules, by the way, at the Board of Trade. There were zero rules. I mean, you wanted to take somebody to the cleaners, you just did it. In fact, it was expected. There were some individuals, but well-known individuals. One called Benjamin Hutchinson, Old Hutch, who pretty much was the central character of the board. And then there'd be James Patton, and these two individuals were known as the Wheat Kings. They would corner the market. They would own so much, so many bushels of whatever they were trading in that no one could. I mean, they just forced the prices up. I mean, Patton went to London, England, Manchester, I think, and tried to pull his tricks over there. They basically tarred and feathered him and kicked him out of the country. He was known as the man who raised the price of bread. But Cutton loved these individuals. They were his heroes. These were not despised individuals in his world. His world said, these are amazing individuals and I want to be like them. And he spent a long time being mentored by them, learning their tricks. He went finally to work for himself in 1904. Left the British commodity trader, and then started conducting only business for himself after that point. never traded for any other individual. His first big coup was the Sioux Line stock, which was interesting because it's stock, not a commodity. But all through I'd say the early 1900s into before the First World War, he was trading largely in corn and wheat and grains, and this is where he made his first millions.
But he did do a little bit of equity trading as well.
A little bit, but it was not a distinguishing factor. I think the Sioux Line stock just happened to be something that he lucked into. He wasn't all that interested in the stock itself, other than what it could give him financially. He didn't later on in life didn't follow the railroads. He like others, he was more interested in RCA and some of the new technologies like GM and kind of where we are today. We're all enticed by high tech.
But early 20th century, the railroads were still a big factor on the exchanges.
But seen as an old technology. By that time, the train technology was already there. It had already been developed, and they already had a lot of the lines had amalgamated, and I don't think Cutton was interested as much as what he could do with the high tech firms.
Right.
So anyway, he was then known for. He got married in 1906. He's in Chicago. He marries a woman by the name of Maud, and Maud was a sales lady at high-end fur hat and fur shops on the Chicago Miracle Mile, and she was very much like him. She was socially awkward. She didn't necessarily like to socialize. They never had children. They couldn't have children. I think they treated each other very well. Because they couldn't have children, they gave millions to children's philanthropies, and later on, in 1911, he started buying the land to his estate outside of Chicago, about 30 miles outside of Chicago. And in 1922, he was robbed. He and his wife were at their estate on an evening, and in March, and gangsters showed up with their guns and basically ransacked the estate, put them in a vault, an airtight vault, along with their domestic staff, with the intention of suffocating everybody, leaving them there to die. Took off and took all the silverware and everything else they could find in the estate. So Cutton was known at that moment as launching the biggest private manhunt ever, to try and find these individuals who had stolen from him. And took him 8 years. He finally got everybody, put them all in jail. That's another an amazing aspect to his story.
How did he get out of the vault?
He his valet had a kind of a small steel ruler. I don't know if you've ever seen these little steel rulers.
Yes.
He kept as a keepsake. Arthur had given the servant this as a gift. He always kept it in his pocket. And so he was able to use that to remove the screws at the back plate because they're inside now, remove the screws at the back plate of the vault, separate the tension bars and spring them free. It only took a few minutes, and now they're grabbing their guns and they're jumping in their cars and they're chasing the bandits down the Butterfield Road at 11 o'clock at night and shooting at them, hitting two of them. The two that were hit, of course, were scooped up by cops later on because they had to attend hospital, and pretty obviously been hit with buckshot. And of course, one thing led to another, and they eventually got them all in jail. But there was quite a manhunt. There was two brothers who were part of the gang. Very difficult to find. They sometimes lived in Canada. They came across the border and hid out here, but he finally got all of them, and which was kind of in his character, right? He'd never give up.
Were they out to get him, to kill him, or were they out for a robbery with just the side of attempted murder?
Yeah, well, it was out basically a robbery went bad in the sense that one of them had worked in the Cutton farm, and Maud recognized this individual, and so they felt that they better get rid of the Cuttons, because they're probably going to be able to trace back. They originally were going to kidnap the Cuttons and ransom them, but later on decided it'd be much easier just to take what was in the home.
You mentioned never give up. I have this little metal sheet in front of me, which was given to me by one of my partners, and it says, never, 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 never give up. Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
It's about this time that he's getting dissatisfied with the regulatory framework in Chicago, is it?
Yes.
And you I think you know this, Robert, but I'm not sure. I moved to Toronto from Winnipeg. So even though Winnipeg only gets one reference in the book, I loved it. At that time, it was the only free market left in North America.
That's right.
And I personally don't think there's been a really good book on the Winnipeg Grain Exchange, which is one more good piece of research which we need, business history which we need. So you can make that your next book.
Well, I'd love to. You always have to take what Cutton says with a grain of salt. And in 1922, the government brought in and passed what they call the Grain Futures Act. And this is the first that I mentioned earlier that there was no regulation of the board. You could do basically whatever you wanted to do. This was the first legislation in 1922 that attempted to place constraints, legal constraints on how you could trade and what you could do. The requirement, which everybody, all the traders, it's the end of the world, we can't possibly work this way, was a requirement. You simply reported what your holdings were. I mean, they didn't even want to do that. So they saw this as a huge imposition. They refused to comply in a lot of cases. They went back to business as usual. Grain Futures Act kind of hung out there without any teeth for a long time. And largely that's because the individuals like Patten and Cutton were leading the charge to basically ignore it and get around the fact that they had to at least report. They really believed that even reporting your holdings was something that would kill the markets, and they made the argument that especially commodities markets, where farmers are trying to lock in their profits through futures devices, um, which was a valuable thing to farmers, and still is. Where if you want to make sure that you're not going to spend your entire season growing wheat and then end up with nothing at the end of the day because you got killed by a slump in prices. So they could lock in what they wanted to farmers and use futures as a means to doing that. The argument was, and still is, you can't do away with liquidity in that market, because the moment you kill the liquidity, you kill the speculators in the market, and the liquidity dries up, and there will be no pools of money to absorb the risks.
Right. So what year did he move to New York?
He basically didn't have a particular year. He gradually migrated. He always lived in Chicago. He when he went to New York, he only stayed in hotels. He didn't. He had a cousin. Sorry, yes, a cousin. His name was Ruloff Cutton, and Ruloff was a stockbroker for a big stock firm in New York, and he used Ruloff as his one of his major lieutenants in carrying out his trades in New York. Arthur worked through 6 to 7 we worked between 6 and 7 brokers and approximately 35 to 40 accounts, because he didn't want to be traced back to any one individual trade.
I guess I hadn't read it carefully enough. I hadn't understood that point. So he made a fortune on Wall Street, but he didn't live there full time.
No, he did not. He when he showed up, he don't forget there was other individuals doing the same thing. So he was meeting people like the Fisher brothers. Do you remember the Body by Fisher,
Yep,
the old
yep.
GM cars? These are the 7 brothers who created the car vehicle, the chassis for GM. They created the Cadillac and Buick and other individual cars. So he met the 7 Fisher brothers who had so much money that they were looking to do the same thing. Where do I invest? They had like Cutton had given up on Chicago because of they saw the impending legislation coming to Chicago, whereas New York remained still largely the Wild West. Again, there was no constraints on trading. There was huge pools of capital that could be manipulated compared to Chicago. So the ability to control prices was just that much easier out of New York. I think Cutton always loved Chicago. He loved his estate, and he much preferred to live in the country. I don't think he would have survived living downtown anywhere near in New York.
Manhattan. And he was also close to the GM of GM.
Yes, Billy Durant. William Durant started General Motors actually twice. Built the company, got kicked out, built the company again, got kicked out. Billy Durant was probably as wealthy as Cutton, played the market as an individual like Cutton. So you had the Fisher brothers, you had Billy Durant, you had individuals like the chemical company, DuPont. Yes, DuPont.
Yeah.
And there was an individual that was working for DuPont who got to know Cutton very well. So they were all intertwined. They all knew each other. They're all playing the same games. I don't know if oh, by the way, Ruloff Cutton worked for a firm called E.F. Hutton.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And
But with Durant, if I recall correctly, his right-hand person as senior staff guy was a Canadian. I don't know if that had any impact on the relationship between the two of them.
I didn't know that.
But the story, which I find intriguing, and it's a bit of a sidebar, but Durant, like a lot of other people, he was a high roller on Wall Street, and then it went to hell, and he ended up at a bowling alley in Flint, Michigan.
That's exactly correct. He and he went through it twice. I mean, he didn't learn the first time. Got thrown out twice because he was just too much in a hurry to build the company.
Yeah.
He would go out and buy a multi-million-dollar firm one day, and then the next day buy another one. So he was impetuous and not strategic in the way he was managing the firm, and so the bankers had to get rid of him.
And bring in Alfred Sloan.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So anyway, these guys are what where are they making their money? They're after firms like RCA. I mentioned Union Carbide was a big one at the time. National Cash Register, General Motors, of course, Woolworth, U.S. Steel. Don't forget the landscape was changing in the U.S. It was the first time ever that there were more people living in cities than in rural locations. The ownership of automobiles was skyrocketing. People could get behind the wheel of their car and drive to a department store and buy the latest fashions, and consumerism was rampant. It was a buy now, pay later attitude, which was picked up by the stock market in terms of putting down a certain amount of money and 10% and taking the rest, buying the rest of your stocks on credit. It was a different mentality. We had the beginning of Prohibition. We had the jazz joints. We had just a different attitude was breaking open in the U.S. and Cutton and his cronies were going to take full advantage of that, and they hyped stock. They would often create two accounts. They would create a holding company, and they would create a trading company, and they would buy and sell among themselves to make it look like the stock was skyrocketing, when in fact it was just them buying among themselves. They were paying this is a sad commentary. They were paying journalists huge sums of money to create positive stories about their stocks. That was became well known during the congressional hearings of just how corrupt the media were at the time, including what we would consider today like creme de la creme, like Wall Street Journal and others who would sell their soul for a few bucks and put out a positive story. They were, yep.
Just to make sure that our audience understands, this was not a uniquely American phenomenon, a little bit on the Canadian scene. Hal Jackman has done a great service to everybody by editing and publishing the Jackman Diaries, beginning with his father. And his father gave a speech to the Ticker Club in the late 1920s, criticizing what was going on, because he said you've had this great run up in stocks, and people are projecting that's going on forever.
Right.
But of course it won't. And was it Chalmers who was at the Financial Post at the time? Lloyd Chalmers?
No, I don't know.
He created, well, remember the Financial Post cards?
Oh, yes.
He
That was
created,
the FP Financial Service.
and I'm going to make a little pitch here for CBHA. We're in the process, Dimitri Anastaskis from our organization, of digitizing those cards.
Oh my God! You know, I actually did. I wrote for those cards.
Did you really?
One of my first writing jobs was at the Financial Post. Financial Post Services. They did a survey of mines. They did the yellow card.
Yep.
They did the survey of industry, and you know, it was a horrible. I mean, you sat there day after day, just looking through the numbers and making sure that the all the numbers you were generating for that service were up to date based on the company's financial information. Yeah, that was.
Well, just so you know,
It's actually McLean building where.
Yeah, Chalmers.
Yeah.
That's right. But on the other side, I had been planning to be an historian, and all of a sudden I'm quotes an investment analyst, and I'm going through those cards and I'm saying, boy, here's real history.
Yeah.
And Tabitha, just so you know, every company in Canada had a card. It was yellow. I don't know why it was yellow. And these were mailed out with a notice that after 1 year, get rid of it, a new one would come in, and then they had a white card if something special happened, and a blue card for something else. And we are in the process with the University of Toronto Library and working on digitizing these, so these will be available to scholars.
Wow.
Isn't that a great contribution?
Amazing, yes. That's totally amazing, and that you're able to do that.
Yeah, I'm very happy about that.
I just want to take one quick step backwards. We were talking before about sort of the unregulation in the market. Of course, you know, that's what led to the crash and the Great Depression, et cetera, et cetera. So given sort of the current political and financial climate that we find ourselves in with, you know, new financial instruments showing up, we've got digital currencies around. Do you see any parallels between the actions of figures like Cutton and the behaviors of modern day financial moguls?
Absolutely. I think it's remarkable, the similarities that are taking place. Did I just lose you there? Remarkable the similarities taking place in the market today compared to what was going on, you know, 125 years ago. I don't think anybody understands the technologies today, or very few individuals. We wonder how much of a scam it is. We don't, I don't think, have a lot of trust in some of our institutions that we used to have. I think that we're. This is why I enjoy and appreciate associations like yours, because we have to find our history. We have to remember our history, and if we don't, we're just of course just going to repeat it. And I see that we are repeating it. I think that you know, the dangers that I see in the market now with its overextensions and people willing to take flyers, and how sound we are as an economy and as our financial institutions. I think that I'm worried, and I think that we should make a major push in our schooling systems and our education systems to include more of what you folks are advocating for. So congratulations on what you do. It's hugely important.
Well, the last question here is, as you know, Robert, I'm a huge fan of your book. I think it's a great read. And there were two people who put their names to supporting this. Not only myself, but Angela Reddish from the University of British Columbia, a scholar well known, not just in Canada, but also in North America. And she had this question. and it's similar to the last one, but it's a bit different.
Sure.
She asks you to address the long-term impact of the events described in the book.
Unknown color.
I don't even know where it is. Sorry. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
The long-term impacts, have they had lasting consequences on the markets?
Yeah, I think I attempted to answer that. I don't know how much further. Because I think we're still, we're still always in kind of taking risks, and I believe that we have to take risks. I'm not averse to taking risks. I think you grow economies and society by being entrepreneurial, and I would hate for us to lose that. On the other hand, I think we can be smart about it and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should remember who we are and where we came from, and some of the things we've had to pay a steep price to learn. And again, I think that's what you guys are all about, and can play an important role. Can I just mention, I'd like to talk just very briefly about, the final days of Cutton, if you have a few minutes.
Please.
He, by I don't know, he's, 19, what are we talking here? 1933 is the Pecora Commission. You mentioned that, Joe, that you were familiar. 1933, we've got all these individuals coming before the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking and Currency. We got J.P. Morgan and Harry Sinclair and Albert Wiggin at Chase, and Charles Mitchell at National City Bank. These are all individuals who thought they were immune to any kind of regulation, and although the banking committee didn't have enough teeth to create any great individual harm, they certainly created a public perception that started to hurt they called them the banksters, like the gangsters, the banksters. Right. And Pecora was an amazing individual who the big guys discounted too much to their loss. Cutton went through that, got dressed down by Pecora, was then charged with failing to pay his taxes, tax evasion. There was 2 grand juries that looked at his taxes, and this is going into 1934. They tried to strip his trading privileges on the board. He actually took that all the way to the Supreme Court and won. But again, it was creating a lot of nightmares for Cutton, because he was out there getting too much publicity, and he just simply couldn't afford it. In 1935, he's struck with double pneumonia. He's just worn down. I don't think he was ever going to trade again in his life. His wife came up with a statement that he was basically finished and was going to be sidelined for the rest of his life. He died a few weeks shy of his 66th birthday, and kind of passed into oblivion. And of course, then everybody's looking for his money, and there's all kinds of hearings to probate courts, and looking into, after 10 or 12 years of investigation, that's all they find of probably 50 million that he had at the time. All they find is $350,000. He had done away with the money somewhere. Of course, the thinking, and the thinking still is, but the family always denied this, is that the family received the funds from Cutton. I'm talking the Guelph family. That was always denied by them. So I can't prove it. There's testimony in probate from a guy called Arthur Ashe, who said the money was doled out to the siblings to cover it up. So again, another fascinating tale that still is open today.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. I hope that those who read the book enjoy it.
Oh, it's a wonderful book.
Yeah, well, we had fun.
Good. Okay, sir. Take care.
You too. Thanks, Tabitha. Thanks, Joe.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you for being with us today. And on behalf of the entire CBHA, we would like to say thank you. And to all of the members of our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. Until next time, take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.